Yesterday's prophecies, today's headlines. This is the Hal Lindsay Report. And now, Hal Lindsay.
Good evening, and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsay Report. What I share with you this week may not seem so important or dangerous at first, but listen carefully. The threat to our nation that I'll cover in my main report tonight is enormous. In our new rapidly changing electronic digital age, this threat poses catastrophic dangers to our nation. Dangers most of us never dreamed possible. An insidious computer virus recently discovered on digital photo frames has been identified as a powerful new Trojan horse virus from China. It's called MOCMEX. Computer Associates Company, a prominent computer security vendor, analyzed this latest virus. It recognizes and blocks antivirus protection from more than 100 security vendors, as well as the security and firewall built into the Microsoft Windows. Brian Grayek is head of product development at the Computer Associates. He described MOCMEX this way. It downloads files from remote locations and hides files which it names randomly on any PC it infects, making itself very difficult to remove. It spreads by hiding itself on photo frames and any other portable storage device that happens to be plugged into an infected PC. It is a nasty worm that has a great deal of intelligence. The creators of MOCMEX are too sophisticated to simply be hackers in an internet coffee house. Greg went on to warn that the authors of this new Trojan horse must be a well-funded group of professionals whose malware has specific designs to capture something and not leave traces. This would be the nuclear bomb of malware. This new cyber threat has been also detected in Singapore and the Russian Federation. Previx, a security vendor headquartered in England, says that MOCMEX has at least 67,500 variants. The Director of National Intelligence, Michael McConnell, testified before Congress last week. He said that the cyber threat to America is evolving. It has grown from passive intelligence collection to aggressive cyber strikes aimed at crippling our computer networks and infrastructure. McConnell told the House Intelligence Committee, threats to our information technology infrastructure are an important focus for this community. We assess, as we have assessed for a long time, nations such as Russia and China long have had the technology capability to target U.S. information infrastructure for intelligence collection. And what I want to emphasize here is intelligence collection. Last year, Chinese military hackers penetrated an unclassified network close to Defense Secretary Robert Gates. China's information warfare capabilities are the function of the People's Liberation Army, 4th Department. Many of the Chinese hackers are actually acting on direct orders from Beijing. McConnell noted that the threat is not merely that somebody might steal our secrets. He told Congress some countries and potentially terrorist groups could target our information infrastructure systems not for passive intelligence collection, but for degradation and destruction. Last year, a cyber attack against Estonia was traced back to Russian government servers. The New York Times called it the first war in cyberspace. The attack shut down Estonia's government websites and crippled the country's digital infrastructure. Estonia's biggest bank, Hansa Bank, posted losses in the millions of dollars as a consequence of the attack. The Russian government denied any involvement, but the lesson was clear. If you don't own a computer, you probably aren't all that concerned about cyber warfare. And even if you do, chances are you still aren't too worried. Even if somebody hacks into your computer, it isn't likely you've got the plans for a nuclear bomb sitting on your desktop. The enemy hacking into our government's computers to get secrets is certainly a scary prospect. But most people don't feel it affects them individually. But the attack on Estonia proves otherwise. It was aimed at shutting down the entire digital infrastructure of the country. And when it impacted Estonia's largest bank, it affected everyone who dealt with that bank. If my use of the phrase infrastructure makes the problem sound too obscure and non-threatening, consider this. America's digital infrastructure has become as real as its bricks and mortars infrastructure, and vastly more important. An attack on the nation's air traffic control system would endanger every commercial aircraft in the air and cause many to crash. And this without a hostile shot fired. An attack on a major city's traffic control system would strand hundreds of thousands of motorists and clog the national transportation system. A cyber attack on a city like, say, Los Angeles would cut it off as effectively as a siege. It would virtually shut off the delivery of food, water, and fuel. It would snarl traffic so badly that few people could escape the city. America's communication system is almost entirely digital. Hacking into the satellite network would blind our defensive systems, shut down television and cellular phones, and most radio. It would render our GPS-guided weapons arsenal useless, including our ICBMs and anti-ballistic missiles. It would blind us to incoming ICBMs. The national power grid, on which everyone depends and which is almost completely managed by computers, is equally vulnerable. Imagine the elderly in high-rise buildings trapped in their apartments without working elevators, or trying to survive the heat without air conditioning, or cold without heating. Remember, they have no windows in many of these buildings. Hospitals would be forced to depend on minimal electricity provided by emergency generators. America's economy is almost entirely based on the digital transfer and storage of information. Apart from the cash in your wallet or purse, the rest of your money is on a computer hard drive somewhere. Metropolitan fresh water supplies and sanitation treatment are controlled by computers. Now, I don't need to elaborate on the consequences if those systems are brought down. In their 2007 report, Symantec, a computer security company, said at least 20 countries have been developing ways to use the internet as a weapon, mostly targeting the United States. A similar report from the antivirus company McAfee says that China is at the forefront of cyber warfare. China has been accused of cyber attacks on India and Germany and the United States. And from at least 2003 to 2005, a series of coordinated cyber attacks hit the U.S. military, government, and contractor websites with reckless abandon. Perhaps one of the most important milestones in the growing trend toward cyber war was the 1999 publication in China of Unrestricted Warfare, a book authored by two colonels in the Chinese People's Liberation Army. In it, they argue that access to the internet has removed traditional boundaries and expanded the arena beyond traditional war techniques and strategies. They wrote, "This kind of war means that all means will be in readiness, that information will be omnipresent, and the battlefield will be everywhere. It also means that many of the current principles of combat be modified, and even that the rules of war may need to be rewritten." Do you suppose China's advances in cyber warfare have been helped by the American supercomputers Bill Clinton allowed China to purchase during his administration? Unfortunately, he sold supercomputers to Russia, too. Thanks, Bill. I'll be back after this message. Folks, many of you have written to ask about our new Watchmen on the Wall baseball caps. Boy, are they great conversation starters. And they're available in either navy blue or khaki tan. It's simple. Just send a gift of $25 or more, along with your name, mailing address, and color preference, either navy blue or khaki, to Hal Lindsay Media Ministries, P.O. Box 1475, Palm Desert, California, 92261. Simply ask for your WOW cap. Tell us whether you prefer navy blue or khaki tan, and include your name and mailing address, and get ready to get noticed. The Bush administration has suspended plans to develop joint space ventures with China. The suspensions come on the heels of China's recent successful test of a new anti-satellite space weapon. Testing its space-bound ballistic missile system, it took an aim at an obsolete 4-foot by 4-foot communication satellite orbiting 535 miles above the Earth. The Chinese missile scored a direct hit on the target, blowing it to bits, creating more space debris and increasing the risk of collisions between the debris and other orbiting satellites. According to NASA spokesman Jason Sharp, China's missile test violated an understanding reached by President Bush and Chinese President Hu Jintao during an April summit. Sharp said, "We believe China's development and testing of such weapons is inconsistent with the constructive relationship that our presidents have outlined, including on civil space cooperation." The two presidents had hoped to work on joint moon exploration and space debris avoidance. But space debris is only part of the issue. The real issue is that China's weapon tests put U.S. satellites within China's reach in the event of some future war. America relies on satellites to guide smart bombs, track enemy troop movements, target cruise missiles, provide real-time battlefield communications, and monitor potential incoming missile attacks. Knock our satellites out of the sky, and what remains of our military machine is about the size of Saddam Hussein's pre-Gulf War Iraq, but without technology to make it all work. Not nearly as well equipped. Robert Joseph is the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control. He is also the administration's point man for space security policy. He recently called China's space weapons test a shock. He said it shows that space is a contested environment and that countries are developing capabilities to put at risk our assets for which we are dependent. He said that this is a wake-up call. Undersecretary Joseph noted that the United States needs to ensure that we take the steps necessary to protect the space assets, the right to unfettered access to space. It may be a wake-up call, but we should have set the alarm a bit earlier. Representative Ellen Tauscher, chairperson of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee, was more blunt. She called the test irresponsible and unacceptable, and warned that sticking our heads in the sand isn't going to make it be better. It will only make it worse. The warning, like the wake-up call, would have been a good idea 10 years ago, before the waiver granted by Bill Clinton effectively handed China the technology it needed. It's too late to close Pandora's box now. I'll be right back. Can you believe it? The Hal Lindsay Report is 1 year old, and what a year it's been. Starting from scratch in February of 2006, this program can now be seen in more than 100 million homes across America. It's carried by satellite and cable to almost every nation and territory on Earth, and it can be seen every day of the week from anywhere in the world via internet. All glory goes to God for His provision, and thanks to you for your faithfulness and generosity. Your giving has made this possible. I and my team can't begin to thank you enough. Will you partner with me to make the second year of the Hal Lindsay Report even greater? Time's running out, and we need to warn the world of the dangers it faces, especially from radical Islam. We need to call America to repentance for its moral and spiritual decline. And we need to tell everyone that the end of this age is near. and that Jesus Christ will soon return for his church. But you know, I can't do it alone. I need your help and your support. Please join me as Watchmen on the Wall. Send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsay Media Ministries, P.O. Box 1475, Palm Desert, California, 92261. Or visit my website, hallindsay.com, and click on the Hal Lindsay Report. And get ready to reap the harvest. Defense Secretary Robert Gates made it official this week. A U.S. naval buildup in the Persian Gulf is underway. The United States plans to position and maintain 2 complete aircraft carrier strike groups in the area. Altogether, the U.S. naval presence will include more than 50 warships and support vessels. One carrier group has already been deployed in the Gulf. The second group, led by the USS John C. Stennis, is expected to arrive over the next few weeks. Officials said the Bataan Expeditionary Strike Group will also sail into the Gulf. The ESG, consisting of 7 warships manned by 6,000 sailors and Marines, will perform maritime security and other missions. This is the largest U.S. naval buildup in the Persian Gulf since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Secretary Gates explained, "The purpose of that is simply to underscore to our friends as well as to our potential adversaries in the region that the United States has considered the Persian Gulf and that whole area and stability in that area to be a vital national interest." He denied the buildup meant the U.S. was planning to go to war with Iran. Instead, Gates said it's meant to warn Iran not to interfere with U.S. efforts in Iraq.
What we are trying to do is, in Iraq, counter what the Iranians are doing to our soldiers, their involvement in activities, particularly these explosively formed projectiles that are killing our troops, and we are trying to get them to stop their nuclear enrichment.
But U.S. denials don't seem that convincing. If the idea is to convince the Iranians to mind their own business and stay out of Iraq, then why tell them we're only bluffing? On October 30th, 2000, Congress established the EMP Threat Commission. Its job is to assess the vulnerability of the United States to an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, attack on the homeland. An Iranian military policy paper entitled Electronics to Determine Fate of Future Wars was published by, now this is a tongue twister, Nasriya-e-Siasi Nazami in 1999. It proves that Iran has been giving the military value of an electromagnetic pulse serious consideration. Nazami wrote, "Once you confuse the enemy communication network, you can also disrupt the work of the enemy command and decision-making center. Even worse, today when you disable a country's military high command through disruption of communications, you will, in effect, disrupt all the affairs of that country. If the world's industrial countries fail to devise effective ways to defend themselves against dangerous electronic assaults, then they will disintegrate within a few years. American soldiers would not be able to find food to eat, nor would they be able to fire a single shot." Note that the Iranian policy papers specified American soldiers as the targeted enemy. In the late 1990s, Iran conducted several of what the West considered to be failed tests of its Shahab-3 medium-range ballistic missiles. In July 1998, U.S. satellites detected the mid-air explosion of a Shahab-3 over Iran. GlobalSecurity.org reported that the rocket exploded or was detonated about 100 seconds into the flight, either because of a mishap or because the Iranians, satisfied with its performance, detonated it by remote control. Globe Security later reported that Iran conducted a third test launch on 21st September 2000, but the missile apparently exploded shortly after liftoff. And again, Iran conducted an unsuccessful flight test of the Shahab-3 medium-range missile in July 2002. Each of these failed tests ended at approximately the same altitude, between 180 and 200 miles above the Earth. Now, according to the EMP Threat Commission, a single nuclear warhead detonated at that altitude over the east coast of the United States would fry every electronic device from southern Georgia to New York City and as far west as the Mississippi River. Cars would quit running, water plants would shut down, food delivery would grind to a halt, mass communications would cease, banking records would be wiped out. Eventually, millions could die of disease and starvation. An EMP attack would come without warning and almost without notice. Most people wouldn't even notice the flash in the upper atmosphere. There would be no noise, no fallout. It would seem like a normal power outage at first. Without any way to communicate with each community with the other, it would assume it was a local event. It might take days or weeks before word got out that we're under attack. By then, most of us would have exhausted what emergency supplies, if any, we had stored away, and would just be learning that there will be no more coming. According to Frank Gaffney's new book, War Footing, thousands of Scud missiles exist around the world, and they're said to cost less than $100,000 to purchase from willing suppliers like North Korea. In December 2002, a North Korean ship was intercepted temporarily as it prepared to deliver 12 Scud missiles to Yemen. Gaffney also notes that Al-Qaeda has a fleet of freighters capable of launching a Scud mobile missile. North Korea has threatened to sell nukes to terrorists. We need to start worrying. Mr. Gaffney is right about one thing. This is a cause to worry. But he's wrong about another. We should have started worrying 10 years ago. And speaking of cause to worry, last week, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez was given virtually unrestricted authority to rule his nation by decree. Last Sunday, after a weekend of intense closed-door negotiations, one of America's most revered investment banks filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. After 158 years, Lehman Brothers is no more. It's an ignominious end for an organization that survived the Civil War, the Great Depression, both World Wars, and the September 11th attacks that destroyed its headquarters in the World Trade Center complex. The firm searched desperately for a buyer to save it. However, both British-owned Barclays and Bank of America walked away at the last minute. Instead of buying Lehman, Bank of America decided to purchase troubled Merrill Lynch, instantly making itself the largest bank in the United States. With around $600 billion worth of outstanding debts, Lehman bankruptcy is the largest in U.S. history. It's 10 times the size of the Enron fiasco. Its creditors include major banks and investors from every corner of the globe. After the announcement, the Dow Jones Industrials dropped over 500 points, the sixth worst fall in history. In the course of 1 year, 3 of the 5 major U.S. investment banks have disappeared. The result is the greatest shift in our financial landscape since the Great Depression. More bank failures are predicted in the coming months. This is expected to put further pressure on the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the U.S. Treasury to maintain stability in day-to-day consumer banking operations. Steve Leisman is a senior economic commentator for CNBC. He described the cause of the crisis this way. As an industry, Wall Street borrowed $3 trillion, a tremendous amount of money, in order to expand its business. And they didn't have the business to back it up. Banks leverage borrowing at levels of up to 30 times their assets. It only took a minor default brought about by the housing crisis to put these firms out of business. Just a couple of years ago, many consumers thought it was prudent, or at least convenient, to use their house as an ATM machine. Taking a second mortgage on your home used to be an extreme measure. But in their quest for greater profits, banks packaged those second mortgages as home equity loans. It suddenly became a socially acceptable way for homeowners to live beyond their means. The easy availability of credit during the housing bubble resulted in what some see as an artificial expansion of our economy. Yet all the warnings about the irresponsible growth of bad credit were dismissed with the mantra that what's good for the corporation is good for America. There's another word for this: greed.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
Now that the chickens are coming home to roost, we've realized that what's good for the corporation isn't necessarily always good for America. But it has been good for one entity in particular, the Federal Reserve System. The stock market peaked on September 3rd, 1929. 2 days later, prominent financier Roger Babson gave a speech in which he warned sooner or later a crash is coming and it may be terrific. Later that same day, the market declined by 3% in what became known to history as Babson's break. Banks issued margin calls to speculators who were using borrowed money to play the stock market. The Federal Reserve started tightening credit, squeezing investors further. On October 29, 1929, the speculators' bubble burst. The stock market crash of 1929 was the very thing the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 to prevent. It was obvious to many others besides Roger Babson that allowing speculators to gamble on borrowed money is a guaranteed disaster. The Fed should have, and I believe did, know that. It's worse than loaning money to losing gamblers in Las Vegas. But the banks that together owned the Federal Reserve were making too much money off the speculators to put on the brakes when the slide began. Indeed, the only ones to make any money during the Great Depression were the Federal Reserve banks and their predominantly foreign directors. Strong banks flourished, weaker banks failed in an economic survival of the fittest contest. The only ones that survived were those linked to the Federal Reserve. In one fell swoop, they centralized the banking system under their total control. In a speech in 2002 to mark the 90th birthday of economist Milton Friedman, current Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke admitted that the Fed was responsible for the crash of 1929. After his more arcane explanations of the various blunders of the Fed made during the lead-up to the crash, he concluded by directly addressing Mr. Friedman. Regarding the Great Depression, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again. Oh, yeah? The current subprime mortgage crisis is another one of their textbook management by crises scenarios. It doesn't take an economic genius to figure out what happens when banks start making 120% mortgage loans at subprime rates. In case you don't know, a subprime rate is a higher interest rate charged to individuals who would not typically qualify for a loan at the prime or lower rate. Often these borrowers are turned away from traditional loans because of their low credit scores or other factors that suggest they have reasonable chance of defaulting on the debt repayment. The higher interest rate translates into tens of thousands of dollars worth of additional interest payments over the life of the loan. Ironically, The borrowers who can accept those loans are usually the ones who can least afford them. Eventually, those rates rise, and so do the mortgage payments. To a homeowner who can already barely afford his house payment, a 2-point uptick in his mortgage rate puts him over his limit. And since he financed 120% and has none of his own money tied up in the property, it's cheaper just to walk away and let the bank have it. The lenders knew the risk, but the immediate profits were high enough to justify it. The Fed knew the risk, but the profits were high enough to justify the risk. The Federal Reserve is run, after all, by the bankers who represent the banks they own. And it was the banks and the bankers who then, as now, had the most to gain. You know, that's kind of self-dealing, isn't it? Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy as a consequence of the collapsing subprime loan market. It will be the largest collapse in the history of the world. This means that banks around the world that invested with Lehman Brothers are taking a hit. Insurance companies like the failing AIG that issued non-performance policies will run out of money before they run out of claims. The U.S. government recently bailed out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But what about all the other banks that have already failed? Where was the Federal Reserve? Last week, former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan called the current financial crisis a once-in-a-century event. He also predicted that we would see the failure of more major financial institutions. Greenspan's predictions may become just as self-fulfilling as Babson's did. Much of a prediction. It was more like a Babson break. Everyone is busy trying to pin the blame for this gigantic economic crisis. As expected, many are assigned blame according to what benefits their own agenda. It's important to soberly look at what is taking place and why. The real power behind our financial policy is the unelected international directors of the Federal Reserve System. Mostly, they're not Americans. They're not elected, and they're not accountable to anyone but themselves. No matter who's president or who controls Congress, there's little they could have done to prevent this current catastrophe. That's supposed to be the Federal Reserve job, isn't it? Americans were sold a bill of goods in 1913. They were led to believe that the creation of a previously unconstitutional central banking system, deceptively called the Federal Reserve, was necessary. Proponents claimed it would prevent a future collapse of the growing banking system in times of national crisis. In other words, it was created to prevent exactly what was allowed to happen in 1929 and has been allowed to happen now. Just consider these questions. In the many financial crises since 1913, who always made a profit? Which banks survived these crises? Who could and should have prevented them? How many times have the American taxpayers been stuck with the bill for their reckless profit-taking? When you thoughtfully answer these questions, you can't help but conclude that America is no longer in control of its own destiny. When you also consider that most of the behind-the-scenes directors of the Federal Reserve believe in a one-world government, you may begin to see the real meaning of the scenario predicted in the book of Revelation, chapter 13. The mark of the beast predicted there is associated with the Antichrist's takeover of the world through economics. Emerging to lead the world from a global economic catastrophe, he requires that all mankind receive his number, 666, on their hand or forehead. Unless they do, they will not be able to buy or sell or hold a job. I believe that 666 is simply a prefix that activates each individual's number. For instance, in America's Social Security number, In other countries, it'd be different, but it would activate their actual number. But here's the catch. In order to get this number, each person must swear allegiance to the Antichrist as God. And only those who believe in Jesus Christ will have the courage and the motivation to reject the mark. They will know that to receive this mark means separation from God forever. Just think before the computers and the RFID chips of today. Such a thing would never have been possible. This once again proves the divine authorship of Bible prophecy. As I said before, I believe the Antichrist will gain control of the world in the midst of a worldwide economic disaster. He will arrive with what will seem to be the ultimate solution to mankind's problems. His platform will be peace and security and prosperity for all. Sound familiar? Fellow Watchmen, you know, I've said many times, in fact, on this show, that time is growing short to the return of Jesus Christ. In closing, I want to just share briefly some of my experience at looking at Bible prophecy over the last 40-something years. First of all, way back in the 60s, I saw that the Soviet Union was rapidly becoming a dominant power in the world. And by the 70s, it looked like they would take over the hegemony of the world. But from prophecy, I said, something has to happen, and the Soviet Union has to fall from being this big of a power. Prophecy says they would be a dangerous military power in the last days, but not a dominant one. Then 1991 came, the Soviet Union imploded from within, and during the 90s, they became what appeared to be a has-been. But now, just in the last 5 years, Russia has become a very dangerous military power. I also said in looking at prophecy, particularly Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, that Russia would have to form an allegiance with the number one leader of the Muslim powers that will be in league with them, and that is Iran. And they would have to align themselves with the Muslim powers that surround Israel. Now we see Russia angry because of what we're doing in the south of Georgia and so forth, and they have deliberately gone into an axis arrangement with Lebanon, Syria, and Iran, or Persia, the very ones Bible prophecy predicted that they would pull together with and launch the last attack that will start Armageddon. That's now forming in place. I also said that something was going to happen to the United States because the United States cannot be the world power of the days just prior to the return of Jesus Christ. And now I believe we're beginning to see the economic reasons why the United States will no longer be the major power. From prophecy, I know that power has to shift to Europe. And those who really know what's going on in the world know that the real economic center of the world is in London. And the powers that go out from there. Even the Federal Reserve is really controlled by several from there. So this is all forming together just as prophecy predicted. This means we're in the very last period before all of these things swing into the final phase of the tribulation. That's why I say, don't put off receiving Jesus Christ and the gift of pardon that he promised to give you. He purchased the pardon for you. You have to receive it. God bless you. That's it for tonight. I'll see you next week, God willing.
You've been watching the Hal Lindsay Report. To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Hal Lindsay Media Ministries, P.O. Box 1475, Palm Desert, California, 92261. You can also support this ministry online. Visit hallindsay.com.